Ms. Cara Bates-Tang et al. I work for MSU Extension here in Lewis and Clark County. I've been in this gig for about 3 years. Prior to this, I was a high school science educator, and I had a background in working in different biology labs, for instance, wildlife biology, and also studying viruses. And I'm here today to talk to you about beekeeping basics. So our objectives today are to identify the main parts of the honeybee, compare the different honeybee races, recognize different honeybee hive types and beekeeping equipment, and link the changing Montana seasons with beekeeping practices. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Dale Hill, the Hive and the Honeybee, which is a wonderful resource if you're looking to learn pretty much everything about beekeeping and honeybees, the Master Beekeeping course at the University of Montana, and Scientific Beekeeping, specifically Randy Oliver. So a little bit more about me. My primary job with MSU Extension is to run our 4-H program, but I do this beekeeping as well. So I'm actually doing a citizen science project, which I'll talk to you more about later on in this presentation. I help collect swarms. So there's a picture of me collecting swarms, and I live over by Lake Helena, which I really enjoy. And so I like kayaking and being outside. First of all, what we should know about honeybees is that they are a superorganism. So this means that it's a whole bunch of individuals that collectively help them survive. If they're out on their own without everybody else working together, then they're not going to make it. So they're considered a superorganism. So some basic honeybee biology. Honeybees, their Latin name is Apis mellifera, and general insect anatomy. What makes them insects is that they have a head, a thorax, an abdomen, 3 pairs of legs, and 1 pair of antennae. And this photo here shows a diagram of a honeybee. So the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, their legs, and just the general structure of the honeybee. So when you're looking inside a honeybee, their circulatory system is hemolymph, which means that there's a fluid on the inside of the honeybee, but they're not constrained by blood vessels like in our bodies. So they just wash over all of the organs and swish back and forth, and that's what carries the nutrients through the honeybee's body. They also have a nervous system that runs from their head clear down their thorax and their abdomen. They have hairs all over their body, and that's what they use to sense things in their environment, along with their antennae. And they have a stinger at the end here with a venom sac. And so that stinger, you might have heard this before, but it has barbs on it that make it so when it sticks inside your skin, it kind of hooks in there. So if you ever are stung by a honeybee, it's actually still hooked to that venom sac. So you don't want to like squeeze it or use tweezers to try to get that stinger out. You want to actually just scratch it away, because if you squeeze it, you might be squeezing in more of that venom. And unless that's something you're going for, you're going to want to scratch it away. Honeybees see differently than we do. So if you're looking at this photo here, it shows the spectrum of light. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So Roy G. Biv, if you've ever heard that before. Humans can see red through violet, whereas bees don't really see the red color. To them, that's just going to appear dark. And so if you're looking at this photo here, to the left, you're seeing a flower that has yellow with red stripes. And to the right of it is going to be that same flower, how it would look like to honeybees. And if you're looking at it, you'll notice those red stripes are actually just, again, that dark kind of black color. And you'll notice that the coloration is just different. It has blue on the inside, and some flowers are even more different. For instance, there's some flowers that might to us just appear yellow, but then to a bee, it's going to have all of these different patterns in it to try to guide the bee to where that nectar and that pollen is that they're looking for. There's also different castes among honeybees, and there's a difference between the males and the females. So in this photo to the very left, we're going to see a normal female honeybee, a worker. And so this is her to the left. To the right of the female worker, you're going to see a male drone. You can see that the male drone is bigger in size. Another main difference between the female honeybee and the drone is that the female honeybee has a stinger, but the drone actually does not. So when I'm showing bees to kids, or if I'm in person with folks, I might bring them a few drones and allow them to kind of play with them because they won't sting you and they're adorable. I mean, I think they're adorable. To the very right, you're going to see a queen honeybee. You'll notice her abdomen is much larger. So the queen is a female, but she is considered fully developed. She's been fed royal jelly from the time she was, a very small larva into adulthood, and they'll continue to feed her what's called royal jelly throughout her lifetime. The royal jelly typically has more pollen in it because that's a protein source, and she needs that because she's laying up to 2,000 eggs a day, which is kind of intense. So that is her one job, is to lay eggs, but she'll also express pheromones, which is what keeps the colonies together. So different hives, the way that honeybees can recognize which hive is theirs is by the unique pheromones that this queen honeybee is giving off. So again, the queen is a fully developed female. Here's another photo of her. The one in this slide, you'll notice that she's marked. Some beekeepers will mark the queen. They'll just use a little bit of nail polish or a special marker, and they'll mark the queen so that she's easier to find when they're looking in the hive. Because in order for the hive to be healthy, you have to have a healthy laying queen. That's what keeps the whole hive together. So in this photo, you'll see another queen, but in this one, she isn't marked. And you can see why it would be a little bit difficult to find her because they are all pretty much the same color. So you're just looking for that long abdomen. Another interesting point about queen bees is that they can live up to 4 years, whereas a regular worker bee, they can live up to 21 to 40 days in the summer. So that's a major difference. And that comes down to their cell membranes, is what researchers think. The cell membranes of the queen bee are just a little bit different than the worker bee, and they are less prone to be oxidized. And so that allows the queen bee to live longer. The same thing can be said for us. This is why we're told to ingest antioxidants, is because it helps you live a little bit longer. It helps prevent oxidation of your cell membranes. And so the queen bee naturally has that. And so she's able to live a fairly long time. Another reason worker bees only live 21 to 40 days, especially in the summer, is because their last job is a forager, meaning that they're leaving the hive, they're going and they're looking for flowers and trees and grasses that are supplying pollen and nectar, and then they're bringing that back to the hive. They'll fly up to 3 miles away, sometimes further, in order to get an adequate supply of nectar and pollen. In the winter time, when they're just kind of hanging out, trying to stay warm and eating honey, they're not flying around outside the hive. If they do, they die. And so they'll live up to 6 months in the winter time. So right now, honeybees in their hives here in the Helena area, some of those bees that survive throughout the winter are starting to die off, and the queen is starting to lay more eggs to create new bees for the summertime. So one interesting thing about honeybees is they have trophy husbands. So those are the drones, and I'll go back and show you the drone one more time. So the drone is this one in the middle here. You can see how big he is. So if a hive has a lot of drones, it's really showing, it's an indicator that that hive is prosperous. They're doing really well. They have a lot of the materials that they need to survive, and they're able to create a lot of drones. And this is interesting because drones, they don't really do a whole lot. Their one job is to mate with virgin queens, and then after that, they'll die. And even if they don't die mating with a virgin queen, they only live for about a month. So I work with a researcher, and she likes to equate drones to this model over here. They're always young, they're always fit, and they're just looking for a mate. And I've also heard them being described as teenage boys too, because what they do is they eat and then they go find a place called a drone congregation area where they hang out with other drones and just wait for a girl to come by. And so that's the drone's job. And actually, another interesting thing about drones is if they do manage to survive through the summer, they're going to get kicked out of the hive in the fall because the girls don't want them eating all their food for the winter. So they get kicked out and they get killed by the girls at the end of the fall too. So it's a rough time for the guys. So I kind of talked a little bit about the drone congregation areas. This is where, so the drone's job is they leave the hive and then they'll go travel and find a drone congregation area where a bunch of other drones are hanging out. Again, just waiting for that virgin queen to come by so that they can mate with her. And if the virgin queen doesn't come by, then they just go back to the hive. So this diagram here is showing you that drones prefer these drone congregation areas that are closer to home, and they're usually above the treetops, so about 26 meters or 85 feet high. Whereas if that same hive has a virgin queen that's ready to mate, she'll go further away from home to try to find a drone congregation area that's further away. And that's because she wants to have, she doesn't want inbreeding to happen. She wants that different variety of genetics. So she'll go further away. These drone congregation areas are interesting because we just don't know a lot about them. So until now, we haven't had the technology to really locate them. So they've been kind of a mystery. We used to use radar to try to find them, or helium balloons holding some queen pheromones to try to find them that way. And it was really hard. But now we have the drones with the, helicopter propellers. I mean, those drones are awesome because you can fly them, you have a camera. So right now we have a researcher, so the same researcher I'm working with, we're going to call them unmanned aerial vehicles. She uses her UAV to fly up above treetops where she thinks these drone congregation areas might be. And then she hangs a string with some queen pheromones underneath of it and uses that camera to see if that drone congregation area is there or not. She also has a website where you can map out. So if you found a drone congregation area, you can report it and put it in the map. And so that researchers and scientists can use that to further study honeybees, their biology and their behavior. So this is really cool because it's the cutting edge. And we don't really know what the implications are going to be yet because it's just been a mystery. It's been like this black hole of not really knowing what's going on in that situation. So next I have a little video, and it just kind of shows the perspective of that UAV, or that flying drone, taking a picture of the drone congregation area. So that's the string that is holding the queen pheromones, and all those little flying things you see around it are all the drones in that drone congregation area. And the interesting thing about drone congregation areas that we do know is that they persist for long periods of time. For instance, there is a known drone congregation area in Europe that's been there that we know of since 1788. So for some reason, these drones go to the same place for these drone congregation areas year after year, which is kind of crazy when we know that drones only live for about a month, right? Max. So how do they know where to go? And then they have these flight pathways too between different drone congregation areas. And so we're trying to learn a little bit more about that as well. So when you're looking at a hive, again, you have one queen, and she's the one laying all the eggs. You have, at their height, you have about 60,000 workers, and then you'll have 2,000 to 6,000 drones, again, depending on how healthy and prosperous that hive is. When we're looking at how these bees are made, like what makes them a drone versus a worker bee versus a queen, it comes down to whether that egg has been fertilized or unfertilized. So when a virgin queen is hatched and she goes and she finds a drone congregation area, she will mate with multiple drones, and she stores all of that sperm in an organ inside of her called a spermatheca. And when she's done, she goes back to the hive and she starts laying eggs right away, and that's the only time she has to do that. So all of that sperm that she needs for the rest of her life is in that spermatheca. So she'll lay an egg, and then she'll decide if she wants to dispense a little bit of sperm on it out of that organ. So she actually gets to decide if it's going to be a male or if it's going to be a female. So if it's unfertilized, it becomes a male or a drone. And if it's fertilized, meaning that the sperm and the egg connect, then you get a worker bee. And if we feed that worker bee special food, it will become a queen. So really the only difference between a worker bee and a queen bee is what they've been fed. And that's why we call it royal jelly. So when we're looking at the life cycle of the honeybees, you will have a queen laying an egg, which you see here at the bottom of the cell, and then that egg grows into a larva. One thing that this diagram doesn't show is that the worker bees will actually put this jelly around it. It looks like jelly, and it's a mixture of pollen and nectar, and that's what that larva is going to feed on as they grow. When the larva gets to about day 10, they cap the cell with wax, and that's when it turns into a pupa and develops into an adult, where the worker bee adult will emerge after day 21. So there is a difference in development time between a queen, a worker, and a drone. So again, a worker, it takes 21 days to develop into an adult. A queen only takes 16 days, which is a little bit surprising considering that she is bigger and then also that she is more developed. But part of that we think is an evolutionary adaptation, because if a hive loses a queen, then they need to be able to take a worker larva, feed it royal jelly, and have it become a queen again and go out on a mating flight very, very quickly in order for that hive to survive. So we think that this is an evolutionary adaptation. Whereas a drone, it takes them 24 days. Drones just kind of take their time in everything that they do. So the drone takes 24 days to develop. There are different races of bees. I'm going to talk about some of the more popular ones that come up. They are Italian, Carniolan, Russian, and the Africanized honeybee. Italian bees are originally from Italy, thus their name, and these are by far the most popular honeybee. These have the prettiest color, in my opinion. They're this bright yellow, and they're considered relatively gentle, but the Italian bees that I've had have usually been the most feisty, which I think is funny because that's a stereotype of Italians as well. They'll build up really quickly, they'll make a lot of honey, and then they'll also rob neighboring hives. So honeybees will actually go to other hives in the area, and if it's a weak hive, they'll pretty much attack them and steal all their honey. So that's something that happens. And Italian bees are one of those that will do it. And again, I think about the Romans in that situation. I like to make all these comparisons with Italian honeybees and Italian humans. Carniolan bees originated in the Austrian Alps, northern Yugoslavia, and the Danube Valley. They're more of a gray-brown in color, and I find these to be the most gentle. They'll conserve their winter food stores well and build up quickly in the spring again, and they'll construct new combs slowly. But because they can build up so fast in the spring, they're more likely to swarm, which means that half of the bees will leave their hive and form a new hive elsewhere. This is a natural process in the reproductive cycle of bees as a superorganism, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Russian bees are imported from Russia, and they were actually imported from Russia to the United States by the US Department of Agriculture because they were believed to be more resistant to Varroa. So Russian bees are a little more expensive than Italian and Carniolan just because of that fact. Now you might be asking, what is a Varroa? What is a Varroa mite? And I'm gonna show you some pictures of Varroa mites, but this is a pest of a honeybee. And this is probably the biggest thing we have to worry about as beekeepers because it can have a huge impact on the health of that colony. So Russian bees are gentle, they're less defensive, they're less likely to sting, and they have a low chance of robbing other hives. And this is also a good thing because if you have bees going to other hives, they can pick up some nasty viruses or pests of their own because they're visiting these other hives that have their own things going on. Africanized honeybees seem to come up a lot because, you know, they're dangerous and it's just one of those things that has gotten sensationalized over time. These originated in East Africa and were imported to Brazil in the 1950s. Since then, they've been migrating northward. They're pretty prevalent in Texas right now and in the southern United States. And these are very defensive bees. One way to know if you have Africanized genetics in your hive is if you're 400 meters away and they're attacking you. That's a pretty good indicator that they have Africanized genetics. Here in Montana, that doesn't happen too much. And if we do get some of these more defensive bees, one technique that beekeepers use is they'll just kill the queen and introduce a new one. And then the bees settle down right away. So for instance, I had a hive of Italian Carniolan cross bees, and they were very grumpy. They would attack anything in their realm, dogs, me, anything. And so I kind of let them go through the winter. And then that next spring, I went to check on them and they were very chill. And it was like a total 180. And they were very, very nice. And then I look in the hive and I noticed they had actually killed their queen. So people think that the queens are like in charge of the whole hive. But if for some reason the worker bees are unhappy with her in some sort of way, they'll actually tear her to pieces. And that's what happened with this hive, is they didn't like the queen. And so they tore her to pieces. And then they were a lot happier. And so now they're just like one of my chillest hives that I have, and they're doing really, really well. So there's different types of hives that you can choose from. We have wild and natural hives. I'm going to show you what those look like so that you can get an idea of what you would encounter if you were just finding bees in a tree or something. Top bar hives, skep hives, warre hives, flow hives, and Langstroth hives. So this is what wild or natural hives look like. You can see that they're building this comb from like a sturdy top part and then building it down. You'll also notice that there's space between these combs where that bees can cluster and where they can store honey and pollen and grow their brood. They might do it out in the open like this in warmer climates. They might do it inside of a tree, or right here you'll see a rock wall. This is actually from a documentary called Honeyland, I believe, and it's really good if you ever want to watch it. But she pretty much grows her bees, or she beekeeps her bees in more of these natural places, and she's very successful. She has multiple hives just in a whole bunch of different places. So top bar hives are trying to kind of replicate the natural hive structure. So these are the easiest to build on your own because you're basically making a trough, and then you have these wooden slats on the top, and the bees will just build that comb down from these wooden slats. Now, if you're a beekeeper because you want the honey, which is what I do, and I'm shameless about that, I love honey, then this might not be the right choice for you, just because if you want to extract honey from this, you have to take that whole comb and put it in what's called a honey press. And so you squish it and it just destroys that comb. So then the bees can't use it again. So this is a good option though if you want a lot of wax, because then you can make candles and soaps and whatever else you want to make with beeswax. But if you're honey focused, this isn't quite the right choice. Or if you just want bees for pollination, this could also be a really nice choice just for your backyard. There's still work to do on how to winterize it effectively, but everybody has a different technique. Skep hives are kind of that traditional shaped hive that you see with like Winnie the Pooh and things like that. It's a rope basket, and then inside they just put a couple of sticks across of it, and then the bees will build this comb. I like this picture because it shows that there's just a very limited space between these combs of wax, and you'll see that this is very consistent pretty much in every hive that the honeybees make, and we're going to call this bee space. So this is where we come to like the frame idea. So I'm just going to skip ahead real quick to Langstroth hives. So Lorenzo Langstroth, he's the one who figured it out about the bee space. And this is about 3/8 of an inch, where he found out that if you have a space between two solid objects, it can be no smaller than 3/8 of an inch. So when he created his own hive for beekeeping, he was like, all right, between these frames, I'm going to make sure that they are 3/8 of an inch. That way each frame has their own wax in the bees, and it can be more organized. And he was very successful. This is the most common type of hive you're going to see. This is the one that you see out in the fields that the commercial producers put out. And it's because it's easier to extract honey. So we're going to go back to this warre hive. This is that same idea, except that they have foundationless frames. And that means, so looking at frames, so the frames are these kind of wooden things right here. You'll see that this has plastic foundation, and this one up here, this one doesn't have any foundation. So a warre hive is going to have none of that foundation. So it's kind of like a top bar, except it's stacked vertically. And this is just another way if you kind of want to do some more natural type beekeeping to be able to raise your bees, but have it be just a little bit more convenient for you. It's also easier to winterize. So flow hive, this is new technology that's part of Langstroth hives. So basically these frames, which I'm going to stop sharing real quick and I'm going to show you my frame box. So I have what's called a super right here. And so this is one of the bee boxes. It's one that's a little shallower. And this is what it looks like on the inside. And so a standard Langstroth hive box is going to have 10 of these frames. And when you pull out the frame, see, I'll pull out this one. When you pull out the frame, they look like this. So this one has foundation on it. So that plastic foundation. And the bees are going to build their wax. So this is all wax through here. The bees are going to build their wax on that foundation. And when they put honey in it, this is what it looks like. So this is capped honey. So once they have the honey in there and the honey is good to go, they'll cap it off with a little bit of wax to better preserve it and keep that moisture in there so that it doesn't crystallize. You might notice if you have real honey that's sitting on the counter for a long time, it crystallizes. That happens in the hive too if it's not capped. So that's what the bees do with that. So this is what it looks like inside the hive, and this is the bee space. So in between two of these frames, which I'll hold them up. Okay. So you'll notice in between these two frames, there's this space here, and that's the bee space. So the bees aren't going to make comb like spanning this space because they need to be able to move in between it. That allows us to be able to actually take these frames out one by one and do what we need to do with them. So these are easier in the Langstroth hive. These are easier to extract honey because you can pull them out just like this. And then when you're ready, you just get rid of that wax capping. Some people will use a hot knife and they'll just shave off that wax capping. Some people use what's called a scratcher. It kind of looks like a tiny metal rake that you just hand hold and like pull across because then it opens it up. And when you're ready to take the honey out, you put it in an extractor, which I have one right here. So it's a big round, it kind of looks like an old washing machine or something. And inside there's a wire cage. And you can put this in the wire cage, which I'm gonna strangle myself on this thing. But you put this in the wire cage. And sometimes they're hand cranked. This one's motorized. You'll turn it on, it'll spin and spin and spin, and the centrifugal force will actually allow the honey to fly out of it. So if you ever rode on the Gravitron and you notice that like you get stuck to the wall, the same thing's happening in this case. So the honey's flying out, hitting the wall, and then it's flowing to the bottom, and there's a nozzle down here. And so then you just open that up and you fill up whatever containers you have full of honey. And so that's the extraction process for the Langstroth hive. The nice part about that is that that wax comb is still in place. It doesn't destroy it. So after you're done taking the honey out, you can pull that frame back out, stick it back in the hive, and then the honeybees can fill it up again with honey or nectar or brood or whatever they need to do. So it's very sustainable. I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Okay. So again, this new technology with flow hives, you'll notice that these frames are plastic. So these frames are plastic, and actually each one of those cells is plastic, and the bee and has like a little crease in it. And the bees will just kind of put a little coating on it and they'll fill it up with honey. And you can actually turn this crank here and the honey will come out the bottom. It all flows to the bottom and comes out, and you can fill up a container. So this is called a flow hive. And even just buying these plastic components, like these plastic frames up here, it's fairly expensive. It can run about $300. But if you're having if you're a hobbyist where you only have a couple different hives, this could be a better choice for you because then you don't have to do all the heavy lifting of these supers and then have to deal with the extractor. You can just go out, turn this crank, and fill up your containers. So when we're looking at the Langstroth hive, you'll see that not all of the boxes on that hive are the same size. So we have two deeps and we have a shallow, and that shallow one is called a super. These deeps are where you're going to find the brood or the egg laying of the honeybees. And then the super is where they're going to put their honey. Now, the reason that this one on top is smaller is because honey is heavy. When they fill up all those frames with honey, this one box, like the one that I just showed you, it can weigh up to 50 pounds, which means that if you'd put one of these deep boxes on top of it and it got filled up with honey, you'd have to lug around 100 pounds of honey wherever you go, which is insane. And I don't want to do that. So I use that super up top and it makes it a lot easier to carry around. Again, if you really want it to be easy, you can spend a little money and get a flow hive. Beekeeping is a fairly expensive hobby, no matter what you do, but you just have to make the choices that are right for you. So again, this is just showing the components inside of that hive to give you a sense of what it looks like inside. These frames are foundationless, meaning they don't have that plastic foundation in them. Some people are really anti-plastic. So far, research shows that having a plastic frame, it doesn't add any toxins to your honey or anything that you need to worry about. But if you are really concerned, you can buy some wax pre-made foundation and you can put it on these wires that are in this frame right here, and that would work as well. So hive stands. People should, in Montana especially, should put their hives on a hive stand. And your hive stand can be as redneck as you want it to be. Mine kind of looks like this cinder block and boards thing going on. Really, why you want them elevated is because if a skunk or some other animal comes along and they want to get into the hive, they have to get on their hind legs. And so then it exposes their belly so that if the bees want to get that skunk away from there, they can sting that sensitive belly and get the skunk out of there. So it helps them defend their hive better, keeps it off the ground for like moisture, ants, mice, other pests that you'd have to worry about. Where you place your hive is also really important. There's a lot of people in the Helena area that would be happy to host a hive for pollination purposes, also in hopes of getting their own honey from you as well. And if you ever want to be a beekeeper, you're going to have to decide if that's worth the effort or not. The biggest thing that you're going to want to pay attention to is that there's flowering plants within a half to 1 mile away. And you also want it to have a discreet placement so that it's not super noticeable about the public. It's a little more common than we'd like it to be for people to steal hives. You're going to want them to be sheltered from the wind, and you want that entrance face towards the rising sun because bees will only wake up and come out of the hive when they're warm enough and ready to. So if you're in a place where it's shady in the morning and sunnier in the afternoon, they're going to be less likely to get up in the morning and go out and start foraging, which with the limited growing season that we have in Montana can be a pretty big deal. You also want to make sure that there's water availability. If they don't have a good water source available, then they might go to the neighbor's house where there's a dog dish full of water, or they might go to that hot tub or that pool or whatever else is in the area, maybe where your spigot is leaking into a bowl, and they will take it over. And if you have neighbors and that's happening to them, they're not going to be happy about it. So that's why in a lot of cities, if you want to keep a hive, they say specifically that you need to have a water source for them. Which brings us to Helena city limits. If you're interested in having hives within Helena, you have to obtain an annual apiary license, and you have to have them, you can see it says water must be within 20 feet of the site. And also there has to be a 6-foot barrier between you and your neighbors so that the bees can't just fly horizontal and hit somebody, because sometimes they do kind of lose control and they'll hit you. They have to go up and over. So there's other beekeeping equipment that we should go over. The main things are the smoker, the bee suit, the bee brush, the hive tool, the honey extractor, which I just showed you, feeders, and pollen patties. So the smoker is your most important tool because it masks alarm pheromones. So when bees think that they're in danger, they give off a pheromone that you can actually smell, and it smells like bananas. So if you're smelling bananas, you should have brought a smoker. So the smoker, what it does is it makes it so the bees can't smell those pheromones. So you might be messing around in the hive, but you have the smoker going, and so they're like, oh, somebody's in here. but nobody seems worried about it, so I'm not going to be worried about it either. And that's how the smoker works. And so that means that they actually get used to you. They do have a memory. So if you come in and you're using the smoker every time and things aren't going too terribly, like you haven't killed too many of them moving boxes around or anything, they're going to be chill even, eventually if you don't have the smoker, but you should use the smoker every time. There is a misconception that the smoke will delay egg laying and will just put the bees back like a week. That's not true. It's not the smoker. It's if you're like moving things around a lot in the hive, if you're breaking apart comb, if you're killing a lot of bees, that's what's going to set them back. You can use any kind of fuel for it. Some people get really fancy and only use certain types of grasses, and some people like me just don't care and they use cardboard. The bee suit is also important. There's a bunch of different flavors of bee suits. You can get one with a hat built in, like you see right here. If you don't have one with a hat built in, I suggest wearing a baseball cap with it, because that mesh face part, it will, if you don't have a hat or something to keep it off your face, it can like hit your face and like reach your skin, which means that the bees can sting you. And that's happened to me, and that's how I know that. As for gloves, some people don't need them, but they're a good idea. I always get stung. It's just the way I'm built, I guess. If it's my hands working with things, they're going to find it and they're going to sting it. Like I said, the 1 minute that the netting on the face shield was touching me, I got stung. But again, some people don't need it. So this is Scott Debnam, and he is one of the instructors with the University of Montana Master Beekeeping Program. And so he's one of 3 main instructors. You can see Jerry Bromanshink right here too. He's a well-known bee guru of the world, actually. But Scott Debnam is I call him the beekeeping Fabio, because he has long, luscious locks and he never wears a bee suit and he seems to be fine. And I don't know why that is, and maybe that needs to be studied. You might have also seen that viral video that's going around where the squirrels were moving a swarm from a floor, and she's also not using any protective equipment. And they're basically magic as far as I'm concerned. And I don't normally promote University of Montana things because I work for MSU and I'm a diehard Bobcat, but I have to say this is a good program. So if you're interested in learning more about beekeeping and you have the time and the money, this is a good program option for you. So the bee brush is another tool. You can either buy a bee brush or you can just pick some grass and use the clump of grass and it has the same effect. Bee brushes have light colored bristles and bee suits are white for a reason. So bee suits are white not just because, you're usually working in the summer and it gets hot, but they're also white because bees will see dark colored things and they'll think it's a bear and they'll attack you. And I've seen this happen with dogs in person. So if a black dog goes anywhere near a hive, they get stung almost immediately. And so black dogs learn pretty quickly that that's not a good idea. Whereas I have a crazy white dog, she gets right up in there. If I have a box sitting there and bees flying around, she gets right up in there and they don't bother her at all. And she'll go in there and start licking honey and they just don't care. So the color really does matter of what you're working with. And that's why with a bee brush, you're going to see light colored bristles versus dark colored bristles. There's also different hive tools. I prefer the one to the right that has this hook because sometimes in your Langstroth hive box, those frames stick together because bees have a bee glue called propolis. It's a mix of resin and wax, and it can get really, really sticky. And so it's nice to have something that can leverage those frames apart and help you take those frames out. Honey extractors, you can rent one from the extension office for $10 a day. They come in different sizes. Some are hand cranked, some are electrical. I suggest doing a extracting party if you have beekeeper friends. Our Helena area beekeepers do a group extraction every fall because it is a pain to clean up all of the tools that have honey and wax everywhere and just to do that yourself. So if you can find an extraction party or some friends, that's definitely the way to go. So sometimes you have to feed your bees, especially here in Montana, where our summer months that are warm enough for bees to go out and find flowering plants. It's a pretty narrow space and time. So we'll supplemental feed them with sugar syrup. And these are different feeder types that we use. And that sugar syrup is really important to get them started. But as they start foraging and bringing in more nectar and pollen, you don't have to feed them anymore. And actually you shouldn't, because then really what they're going to do is they're going to take that sugar syrup and they're just going to put it in the cells and call it honey. But really you're just getting sugar syrup. And that does happen. So there's different grades of honey because of that. A lot of commercial producers will feed their hives with high fructose corn syrup. And the bees, most of the time, they eat that because they have to, because they're constantly moving, because a lot of those hives get shipped to like California for almond pollination, and then they come back. But here in Montana, you shouldn't feed them throughout the year, just when they're getting started and when they're ready to go into winter. Pollen patties are the same things. This is a supply of protein. So we usually give them pollen patties in the spring. In the summer, if there's a dearth, like we're not getting a lot of flowering plants in the area, you might give them pollen patties then too. And it's a little contentious whether or not you give them pollen patties in the fall, but some people do. So there's a lot of places you can purchase equipment, and I have some of those listed here, like Murdoch's, Western Bee Supply, Man Lake, North 40, all of those. If you buy them used, you're going to want to make sure that they are clean and that they haven't had any major diseases in those hive bodies. When you're buying bees, they're going to come in either a package or a nuke. And so in this picture right here, a beekeeper has a package. It's a box with screens on the side, and it's full of about 3 pounds of worker bees and a queen. And then there's a can of sugar syrup kind of in the middle of it to feed them. And so with these, you literally just make space in your hive and dump them in. I had no idea before I started beekeeping that you could just pour bees into things, but they actually attach to themselves, and so you can just pour them. And you can grab clumps of them and throw them into the hive, and it's pretty incredible to watch. So nukes is another way you can buy bees. These bees come in a box that have 5 frames in them. I actually prefer this way, especially if you are a brand new beekeeper, because then you have 5 frames that already have brood in them, that already have some honey, some nectar, some pollen, and the comb is drawn out. So it helps them get a head start on that year to get strong enough to go into the winter. And when you're installing nukes, you just make space in the hive and then you put those frames in. It's pretty easy. So honeybee swarms, I mentioned this earlier, this is a natural part of colony reproduction. So the old queen and about half of the colony are going to move to a new place. This happens if they get really crowded in their own hive. Sometimes, well, actually most beekeepers, they'll try to do what's called an artificial swarm or a split, where they take half of the bees and then they move them to a new hive before they can swarm. So I'm hoping to do that this year. And so then if you have like 1 hive, then that next year you could have 2. And you'll see how they all clump together and just kind of hang on each other. You can actually just grab handfuls of these and stick them in a hive, because they're like sticky. Not really sticky, but the hairs on their legs and stuff, it'll just hook onto things. And so you can grab them with your gloves and you can throw them into things, and it makes it pretty easy to move them around. So also talking about swarms, every year at the extension office, I get calls that people have a honeybee swarm, and literally it's always a honeybee swarm to them. And then when I go and visit, it's not a honeybee. And so I thought it would be good to go over a guide to yellow stripy things. So honeybees and bumblebees are fuzzy. Wasps and hornets and those guys, they are not. And they look like little robots, in my opinion. So this is just a picture of the common bees and wasps that you're going to see. So if we look at this picture to the right, on the bottom, you're going to see a honeybee. And on the right, you're going to see a bumblebee. So you'll notice both of these have hairs. The honeybee has hairs in the thorax, and then the bumblebee has hairs on head, thorax, and abdomen. But if you look up at the wasp, the yellow jacket, the bald-faced hornet, and the European hornet, which you can see the size difference too, you'll notice that the hornets and the wasps, they look like robots. They don't have hairs. They have really defined yellow and black stripes. And in my opinion, they just look scarier. So a lot of times if people say that they have a swarm, it's usually bumblebees. which I try to encourage people to just leave them alone until the fall because they'll leave on their own. So, and bumblebees won't sting you. Some people are like, oh, I've been stung by a bumblebee, but they don't really sting you unless like you step on them or something. I mean, it has to be fairly aggressive, and it also has to be like a queen bumblebee. I've also had bumblebees be brought to me because folks thought that they were an Asian giant hornet, which was a big deal this last year because it got sensationalized by the media. We do not have Asian giant hornets in Montana. They found some in Washington, and I think they eradicated them. Our Montana state entomologist, her name is Alyssa. She's my friend, but also my professional colleague, and we work together, and she gets calls all the time about Asian giant hornets that are actually queen bumblebees, which is really sad because if you kill a queen bumblebee, then you're putting bumblebees in general in jeopardy. But also we have what's called wood wasps, which is the one to the right here. This is a wood wasp. A lot of people will bring those to me and think that that's an Asian giant hornet, and then they get scared because they think right here is a big stinger. Actually, that's just an ovipositor, which is how the wood wasp lays eggs. And so it's not a stinger at all, and it's not going to hurt you. And so they use this to drill holes in wood and then lay their eggs in it. They don't use it to sting. So we got a lot of these this last year. We also have what's called cicada killers. Cicada killers are also really big. I mean, to put it in perspective, cicada killers are about the same size as an Asian giant hornet. And this is how big an Asian giant hornet is, right? So they can look really scary, but cicada killers also don't sting. So if you do think though, if you see something like this and you're not sure, especially between a cicada killer and an Asian giant hornet, like they look similar enough, you can bring it to the extension office or you can contact the Montana Department of Agriculture and we can put your mind at ease. But this one's fairly recognizable because that looks like a really scary stinger and they're thinner and long. And just be assured that that's a wood wasp and it's not going to hurt you. So some tips for beginners: start off with 2 to 5 hives. You can join the Helena area beekeepers. They meet once a month and just talk about how things are going, exchange tips and tricks, and they have guest speakers to help explain things. Just to kind of let you know what's going on in March, the queen's starting to lay eggs. The bees are going out and pooping. They don't actually get to poop all winter, so this is a big deal for them because this is the first time they get to go out and poop. In April, this is when you're going to start seeing their population get bigger and bigger. This is when we treat for mites. So these are the varroa mites I was talking about. These varroa mites will hide with a larva at the bottom of a cell until the worker bees cap it, and then they'll feed on that pupa as it develops, on the fat bodies of that pupa. If you have a really bad mite infestation, then what's going to happen is these bees can emerge with deformed wings because they didn't have the nutrients to fully develop. And these actually prefer drones. So if you're seeing a lack of drones in your hive, this could be part of the problem, is that you have varroa mites and you didn't treat for them. So in May, you're still getting a fast growing population. You'll notice these cells at the bottom of these frames are a little bit longer and look kind of weird and gross. Those are queen cells. So they're really, really big to accommodate for that big abdomen of the queen. And this is a tell that maybe your hive is getting too full and they're getting ready to swarm. So June and July, this is where you start getting your honey. August is where you're really getting your honey. They hit their peak population and you can start harvesting the honey. And then in September, that population starts decreasing. Your drones are kicked out of the hive. I told you that that happens as we go into winter. So bye-bye, boys. And then October is when the winter bees are born and they're going to stay for the whole winter. And this is just a way that we winterize hives in Montana. Some people use kind of a reflective covering, or they might use insulation, They might put hay bales around it to block wind, especially in eastern Montana. You'll notice that there is like a little cage looking thing or a screen in front of the entrance of the hive, which is down low, and that's to keep mice out, especially if you have hay bales around it. If it's open and mice can get in, I mean, that's a sweet deal for them if they can just be warm and eat honey all day. And that stresses your bees out. And bees are expensive. If you buy a package or a nuke of bees, it's almost $200 these days. So if you want them to survive, you have to keep all of these things in mind. There's also bee koozies like you see here. I think that's a little bit overkill, but some people really like them. I typically do the tar paper thing that's right here. If you're looking at, this is a thermal image of bees in a hive. This is where the cluster of bees are. They make their own heat, but also part of their respiration, or the way that they make energy, is that they'll, ingest foods and liquids. And then part of what they produce, or what comes out of them, is water. So if you do have them too stuffed up and there's not enough airflow, then you can get water inside the hive, which if it gets really cold, if you're wet too, that makes it really difficult to stay alive and stay warm enough. So this might seem, weird, but you have to make sure that there's enough air that can go in and out of the hive, and there's enough circulation for them to stay dry and to survive. One of the biggest killers outside of varroa over the winter is getting that moisture in the hive. So just a couple of facts before we end today. It takes about 1 pound of pollen to rear 4,000 bees. So if the average hive rears 200,000 bees during the summer, that's 50 pounds of pollen. So that's a lot, that they have to gather and put in that hive. And pollen can be all sorts of colors. So this is a picture of pollen colors from like yellow to orange to red to purple. And the nectar and pollen sources, like what they're foraging on, whether it be wildflowers or alfalfa or trees like Russian olives, it's going to determine the honey flavor and the color. So honey is nectar that bees have consumed, mixed in their honey stomach with enzymes, regurgitated, and then dehydrated. So I call this the best tasting bee throw up you're ever going to get. So honey is pretty awesome. One thing to keep in mind is it takes one worker bee to produce half a teaspoon of honey in her lifetime. So if you waste half a teaspoon of honey, you've wasted the life's work of one bee, which puts it in a different perspective. And I get super weird about that now if my husband wastes any honey in our house. It takes about 550 bees to make a pound of honey, and workers will fly 55,000 miles and tap 2 million flowers in a summer season. Bees will forage up to 3 miles away, but they'll go even further in dearth conditions, which just makes it really, really hard. Again, dearth is when we don't have flowering plants available to supply that nectar and pollen. And again, this is why hive location is important. So how can you help? You can help us by providing a variety of plants that flower throughout the season. I'm a huge fan of dandelions. I was when I was a kid, I still am. If your yard is infested with dandelions, you can feel a little bit better and maybe put a sign out saying that you're feeding the bees, because it's true. It's one of the first things that blooms in the spring, and it's so fun to watch the honeybees crawl all over them and get a lot of that nectar and pollen that they need. So if you want to know how you can help or what kind of flowers to choose, it's good to know that we are in zone between 4A and 5A, so that you can know what's going to grow in your zone. And then also we provided the Extension Office and also the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Natural Resource and Conservation folks. They all supply a booklet that's called Montana Native Plants for Pollinator Friendly Plantings. And they include bloom periods, and they show which months they're going to bloom so that you can choose, all right, this one's blooming in April and May. I also am going to need some for June and July and some for August and September. And you can plant those varieties around your home.